Mm. Right, let me share my screen and get us started. All right. Welcome, AFAM 200 students. Today we embark on a deep exploration of colonialism, resistance, and the shared struggles of Africans and African Americans. This lecture will provide a historical foundation for understanding the lasting impact of colonial rule while also highlighting the ways in which African and African American leaders resisted oppression and built global solidarity. Our agenda for today will cover colonialism, understanding how European nations imposed political, economic, and cultural dominance over Africa and other regions, the scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference from 1884 to 1885, how European powers divided Africa without African consent, leading to long-term consequences, and African American resistance and independence, highlighting the leaders and movements that fought against colonial rule, from armed rebellions to political struggles for sovereignty. And finally, connections to African American struggles, exploring the shared fight against racial discrimination, economic oppression, cultural erasure, and the global solidarity between African and African American activists. Our learning objectives for this particular lesson is to analyze the impact of colonialism by students will be able to explain the concept of colonialism and how the scramble for Africa and the Berlin Conference reshaped African societies, economies, and governance structures. To to evaluate resistance and independence movements. Students will assess the different forms of African resistance to colonial rule and discuss how African independence movements in the 21st century influence global struggles for racial and social justice, including the African American Civil Rights Movement. Draw connections between African and African American histories. Students will compare and contrast African American colonial experiences with the African American experience of racial oppression, identifying key themes of Pan-Africanism, cultural resilience, and activism that link these struggles across time and geography. What is colonialism? Colonialism is the process by which a foreign power takes control over a territory, exploiting its resources, labor, and people for economic and political gain. Historically, colonialism was driven by the desire for wealth, power, and strategic dominance. It led to the establishment of settler colonies, exploitation colonies, and indirect rule systems, deeply affecting the indigenous cultures and societies of the colonized regions. Colonialism can be divided into different waves. We have early colonialism that took place between the 15th and 17th centuries, where European powers like Spain, Portugal, Britain, and France established colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia for trade and resource extraction. We have high imperialism that took place between the 18th and the 20th centuries. The Industrial Revolution fueled the need for raw materials, leading to the aggressive colonization of Africa and Asia. And finally, we have decolonization, the 20th century to present, where many colonies gained independence after World War II, but the economic and social legacies of colonialism persist. Oh. And this right here, this 1493 Papal Bull, this is a decree that Pope Alexander wrote and was used to justify colonization, used to justify enslavement of people and taking away lands and property and enslaving bodies because they were viewed as uncivilized and unchristian or unsaved. So there's various forms of colonialism, and I created this wonderful chart that I'm really proud of myself. And I really like it. That gives you a quick snapshot into the forms, their definitions, examples of countries where this was taking place, and key features. Um, so as we think about, settler colonialism, a form of colonialism where foreign settlers permanently migrate to the colonized land, displacing or marginalizing the indigenous population. The settlers established political, economic, and social dominance over the local people. As we see on the chart, South Africa and Algeria are key examples. In South Africa, we have the European, the Dutch, and the British settlers that took control of the land, imposed racial segregation, and established apartheid from 1948 to 1994. Indigenous African populations were displaced, forced into segregated areas, and denied political rights. The example of Algeria of settler colonialism, the French colonized Algeria in 1830, encouraging mass European settlement. The French controlled land, industry, and government, while Algerians were treated as second-class citizens, leading to a violent war for independence from 1954 to 1962. Exploitation colonialism, a system where colonizers extract resources, natural, human, or economic, from the colonized region without establishing large settler populations. The focus is on economic gain rather than permanent settlements in the lands or the regions. An example would be the Congo and Ghana. Congo was Belgian controlled, the Belgian controlled Congo by King Leopold II of Belgium, exploited Congo's rubber and minerals, enforcing brutal forced labor, which led to millions of deaths. The Belgian government later took control, but economic exploitation continued until Congo's independence was achieved in 1960. Ghana, the Gold Coast region, was the British controlled Ghana's gold, cocoa, and timber industries, forcing local farmers to grow cash crops for export rather than for their own sustenance. Economic policies favored British industries at the expense of the Ghanaian development until their independence in 1957. An indirect rule colonialism is a governance system where colonial powers use existing local rulers or elites to enforce their rule, rather than directly governing through European officials. This strategy maintained colonial control while minimizing European administrative costs. Examples of this would be Nigeria and India. In Nigeria, the British ruled through local chiefs and traditional leaders, maintaining a hierarchical system that allowed colonial policies to be enforced with minimal British officials. The system deepened ethnic divisions, which later contributed to post-independence conflicts. And in India, the British East Indian Company initially controlled India by using local princes and rulers to enforce British economic and political interests. After the 1857 Indian Rebellion, direct British rule was established, but local elites continued to be used to maintain control. So again, we have indirect colonial rule, we have exploitation colonialism, and we have settler colonialism as our three forms of colonialism. The scramble for Africa refers to the rapid invasion, occupation, and division of African territories by European powers between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Motivated by industrialization, economic competition, and nationalist ambitions, European countries sought control over Africa's rich resources of gold, rubber, diamonds, oil, and more, and strategic locations. Key motivations, as we talked about, was the industrialization, because Europe needed raw materials, okay? Nationalism was this competition between these European nations of who's the best, who's the more powerful, who's the more wealthy. And civilizing missions, which this utilizing religion, utilizing faith or your faith, that cultural imperialism, that your way and your religion and your how you see the world and operate is justified racial dominance, justifies you enslaving human beings in a chattel slavery and taking away lands from indigenous and African and many other folks. So I wanted to provide a map for you that would give you a visual of what the continent looked like from a territorial kind of standpoint with the early empires and early kingdoms that existed prior to any kind of land grab, any kind of dividing and divisions and creating borders that weren't naturally there. This is how the continent pretty much looked like. And I want to thank my Weebly source for this. And I think I saw this also in the site that I have in your D2L Exploring Africa also has this, and it's also in various libraries, historical libraries. But I think this gives you a great visual. I'm spending time on it because I want you to take note of Egypt is in Africa, okay? Ethiopia is right there next to it. You see the coast. Um, this region down here, I believe, is what is considered as South Africa. Um, this is the Congo that we talked about, and Algeria, Morocco, Ghana is around in here, Kenya, other places. So, yeah, you look at it, and these are naturally occurring borders. This is all open. Note that anything that is gray is there's probably it might be people there, but it's not formalized. Okay, it is not. So I thought that you needed to have a good visual of that and keep that in mind. So the Berlin Conference was a meeting of European powers convened by Otto von Bismarck of Germany to establish rules for dividing Africa among European nations without conflict between them. So trying to minimize because they were fighting and everybody wanted what they wanted. So they were trying to minimize that. But peep this, pay attention. No African representation was present, invited, nor consulted. before, during, or after the meeting. Okay. So you come into my country, and as we talked about in other lessons, the Europeans were welcome in certain places because initially it seemed like it was going to be a mutual, wonderful relationship. How is it that you come into my country and you do not invite chiefs, emperors, kings to a meeting about how you're going to divide their lands? Keep that in mind. So, key outcomes of the conference was partitioning of Africa. Africa was divided among the European powers, disregarding of ethnic, cultural, or historical boundaries. And this is why you would see the conflicts and things that took place when people were trying to fight for independence or even some present day. Formalization of colonial rule, we have European nations had to establish control through military and administrative ways in staking their claim to these territories. And economic exploitation. Colonies were forced into extractive economies serving European industries. Okay. So this is another map. This shows you like very early on the African kingdoms and empires that we talked about in the early African civilizations lecture. And so you can see even less boundaries exist in this map. And you can see where, um, oh, I got that wrong. Ghana Empire, Songhai Empire, um, Mozambique looks like right here, the Zulu Kingdom, classic Egypt, Kush, Ethiopia. So you see a lot of the countries. Carthage, see, Carthage is right here. This is Africa. Carthage is right here. So, like, they constantly try to say was not. So, I wanted you to look at that. But then this map over here, um, shows pretty much, I think, um, provides you with what countries hold the maps according to the color codes, uh, who got what in the conference, who, took over things. So mostly when we look at, okay, I'm sorry, I forgot I came back up here and started recording my lecture for class. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm okay. You good? Are you gonna be up for a minute? Okay, yeah, I'll shut that. That might be perfect timing because I'm like on slide like 8 or something like that. All right, I love you. I'm sorry. Okay, bye bye. So the key differences that we can note in these maps is the independent states, minimal European presence, especially around the coastal settlements. There were Islamic states in East Africa, And in the 1914 map, we see nearly all Africa is under European rule at this point. Ethiopia defeated Italy in the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Liberia, founded by freed Africans, remained independent, but new colonial borders. Britain controlled Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana. France controlled Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, West Africa, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Mali, and Madagascar. Belgium controlled the Congo Free State, infamous for exploitation under King Leopold II's rule. Germany controlled Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Togo, but lost these properties, these territories, excuse me, after World War One. Italy controlled like Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia, but failed to try to control Ethiopia. Portugal controlled Angola and Mozambique. Spain controlled small parts of Western Sahara and the Equatorial Guinea. Clearly, these maps show largely autonomous Africa and diverse indigenous states and kingdom in this map right here to our left. And the map to the right shows Africa carved up among the powers and imposed colonial borders that ignored ethnic, linguistic, and cultural divisions. So again, I always want you to have a visual so you can see who is what and what is what. So let's talk a little bit about some of the participants in the Berlin Conference and the organizer. Uh, the Chancellor Bismarck was the Chancellor of Germany and key architect of the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. Known as the Iron Chancellor, he played a significant role in unifying Germany in 1871 and later focused on European diplomacy to maintain German power. Although Bismarck was not particularly interested in colonial expansion, he organized the Berlin Conference to regulate European imperial claims in Africa and to prevent conflicts between the specific European nations. The Berlin Conference was held to formalize this division of Africa among these powers, setting the rules for territorial claims without consulting any African leaders. The conference accelerated the scramble for Africa, leading to European domination over most of the continent by 1914. The Berlin Conference included 14 European nations and the Otto Empire, but no African representation. The main participants were Germany, Otto von Bismarck, who was the host, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Denmark, Sweden, Norway. United States was an observer but did not take any colonies, and the Otto Empire. So I'm going to read those countries again. The 14 European nations in the Otto Empire. Germany, with Otto von Bismarck as the host. Great Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Denmark, Sweden, Norway. The United States attended as an observer but did not take colonies. An Ottoman Empire. Interesting. Now, if you guys are interested in the AFAM 301 foundations, because we talk about this goes into much more detail about this and all of that kind of stuff if you're interested in this further. So just giving you another more current map, the scramble for Africa and the Berlin Compass permanently altered African societies, creating political, economic, and cultural disruptions that persist today. While African nations eventually gained independence, the legacies of colonialism, such as artificial borders, resource exploitation, and social and economic struggles, continue to shape the continent. Impact of colonialism on African societies. Colonialism in Africa was marked by the scramble for Africa that took place between 1884 and 1885. Uh, where European power, which is also the Berlin Conference, where they divided the continent without considering existing ethnic and cultural boundaries. So we have political impacts, we have economic impacts, and we have social cultural impacts, right? So the political impacts and disruptions was a loss of sovereignty. Traditional kingdoms, chiefdoms, and governance structures were dismantled. The loss of sovereignty. Traditional African kingdoms, chiefdoms, and governance structures were dismantled. Leadership dismantled. European appointed leaders often replaced these local rulers, leading to further instability. So, when we think about this leadership dismantlement, European appointed leaders replace local rulers, creating instability. Artificial borders were in place. Colonial powers created arbitrary boundaries, leading to ethnic conflicts that persist today. Look at the example of Nigeria, Rwanda, and Sudan. These artificial borders, where colonial powers created arbitrary boundaries, leading to ethnic conflicts that persist today. Example, Nigeria, well, Rwanda, and Sudan. And this concept of indirect rule, used by the British on Nigeria to control local populations through existing leaders. The economic impact, resources were extracted. Africa's wealth, such as gold, diamonds, rubber, and oil, was exploited for European benefit. Land was taken away from Africans, forcing them into labor-intensive colonial economies, cash crop economies, where economic economies were reoriented to serve European interests, developing a forced reliance on crops like cotton, cocoa, and coffee, reducing local food production and causing famine. So we got resource extraction on the economic area. We got cash crop economies under economic impact. And finally, under economic impact, we have infrastructure for extraction. Railways and roads were built primarily to extract resources rather than benefit African societies. And the social cultural impact, language and education. European languages like English, French, Portuguese replaced indigenous languages in administration and education. Religious transformation. Christianity spread, often replacing indigenous beliefs and traditions. Racial hierarchies. European ideologies of white superiority justified oppression and discrimination. So, under social and cultural impact, we have language and education, where European language replaced indigenous languages. Example, English, French, and Portuguese in administrative practices and in education and schooling. We have religious transformation, Christianity spreading, replacing indigenous beliefs and traditions. And we have racial hierarchies, where European ideologies of this white superiority justified this discrimination and oppression. A great example is the Congo, where King Leopold II controlled Congo as his personal colony, leading to forced labor and the deaths of an estimated 10 million people. The impact on colonialism on North America. Colonialism in North America from 1492 to the 1800s was led by Spain, France, and Britain, resulting in genocide, land seizures, and forced labor for indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. Political impact, the indigenous displacement, where Native American lands were taken through treaties, warfare, and forced removals. An example, the Trail of Tears of the in the 1830s. We have European colonial governments, British colonies along the East Coast, and later became uh, the United States. We have expansion of policies like Manifest Destiny justifying westward expansion at the expense of Native American nations. So, the political impact, we have indigenous displacement, European colonial governments, and expansion of policies. Economic impact, plantation slavery, where enslaved Africans were forced to labor on tobacco, sugar, and cotton plantations. Fur and trade resource extraction, where the French and the British exploited natural resources such as beaver pelts and timber. And how about commercial agriculturalism, where we have indigenous lands were converted to European style farms, disrupting native food systems. So, under economic impact, we have plantation slavery, where enslaved Africans forced to labor on tobacco, sugar, and cotton plantations. Fur, trade, and resource extraction. French and British exploited natural resources such as beaver pelts and timber. And commercial agriculture, where indigenous lands were converted to European style farms. This disrupted native food systems. And the social and cultural impact, the cultural erasure of indigenous languages, traditions, and spiritual practices were suppressed. Racial hierarchies, African and indigenous peoples were systematically marginalized through laws and social structures. And how about religious conversion? Missionary efforts led to forced conversions to Christianity. A key example of the social cultural erasure, racial hierarchies, and religious conversion, we see the Trail of Tears that took place in the 1830s, where the U.S. government forcibly relocated Cherokee, Creek, and other tribes, leading to thousands of deaths. Thousands. So, as we recap, colonialism's long-term effects across Africa and North America led to political instability. Artificial borders and divisions continue to cause conflicts. Economic dependency, where former colonies remain dependent on raw material exports. Colonial suppression, where indigenous and local traditions were marginalized in favor of European norms. And social inequality, racial and economic hierarchies shaped by colonial rule that are still present today. So let's talk about some resistance. Resistance to colonial rule in Africa. There was much more, but I'm going to do some highlights here. African leaders and groups resisted colonial rule. For instance, Shaka Zulu used military strength and state building to resist Europeans and African rivals in South Africa. He unified the Zulu kingdom from 1816 to 1828 by reorganizing tribal groups and creating centralized military states. He revolutionized warfare by introducing the bullhorn military strategy, short stabbing fears, and disciplined regiments. Shaka expanded Zulu power, defeating European backed African groups and rivals, and indirectly challenged British colonial influence by strengthening African resistance in South Africa. His legacy through, though he was assassinated, his military strategies influenced future African resistance movements against European colonizers. And Samori Toure, from 1830 to 1900, was a West African military leader, empire builder, and anti colonial resistance fighter who led a prolonged struggle against French colonial forces in the late 19th century. He founded the Wasulu Empire, which spanned parts of present day Guinea, Mali, and the Ivory Coast. He is a symbol of African resistance and is remembered as one of Africa's greatest anti colonial warriors. His military innovations developed one of the most advanced African armies of the 19th century. Marcus Garvey used political ideology and economic self sufficiency and Pan Africanism to resist colonial rule globally. He founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, in 1914 to promote Black unity, economic independence, and resistance to colonial rule. Advocated for Pan-Africanism, the idea that all people of African descent should unite and reclaim Africa from European rule. He promoted economic self sufficiency through Black owned businesses like the Black Star Line of 1919, a shipping company meant to trade with Africa. He encouraged the Back to Africa movement, urging African descendants to return and build independent nations free of European control, and inspire African independence leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, who later led their own anti colonial movements. Resistance to colonial rule in North America. Resistance to colonial rule in North America took multiple forms, including indigenous resistance, African enslaved rebellions, and later, but we won't discuss that as much, the European settler revolts against colonial powers. These acts of resistance challenged the violent expansion of European empires and displacements of indigenous people and the oppression of enslaved Africans. Indigenous nations actively resisted European colonization through armed conflicts, strategic alliances, cultural preservation, and legal battles. The legal and cultural resistance, the Ghost Dance movement of the late 1800s, was a spiritual movement among the Lakota and other Plain tribes aimed at reviving indigenous sovereignty and cultural identity. Treaties and diplomacy was used, with many tribes negotiating treaties with colonial governments, though these were often broken by Europeans. As for the enslaved Africans in North America's resistance through violent uprisings, escape networks like the Underground Railroad, and maroon societies, which were self liberated communities of escaped Africans. The colonial resistance in North America took many forms. The indigenous resistance of armed rebellions, treaties, and cultural preservation, and the enslaved African resistance of slave rebellions, maroon communities, and escape networks all served to promote and give hope in resistance. Connection to African American struggles. African American leaders engage with Pan-Africanism. And like I said earlier, Pan-Africanism is the belief in the unity of all African descended people globally and the need for political, cultural, and economic liberation from colonialism and racial oppression. African American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey played a key role in connecting Black struggles in the U.S. with those in Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world. The Pan African Congress uh, from 1919 to 1945, W. Du Bois helped organize this international conference that called for an end to European colonial rule in Africa. As for W.E.B. Du Bois and the concept of double consciousness, this comes from his book, The Souls of Black Folks, that was published in 1903 and describes the internal struggle of African Americans who see themselves through both their Black identity and the white dominated society's perception of them. A quote from Du Bois would be, "One ever feels his or her two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two reconciled strivings." And the significance, this idea explains the psychological challenge of navigating a racist society while preserving your Black identity and dignity. The Harlem Renaissance, as an intellectual response to racial oppression, the Harlem Renaissance from the 1920s to the 1930s was a cultural, artistic, and intellectual movement where Black writers, poets, musicians, and artists used creativity to challenge racism and express racial pride. Key figures were Langston Hughes, who used poetry to celebrate Black identity, and I Too Sing America is a great example of that. Or Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote novels highlighting African American folklore and resistance. And let's not forget Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, jazz as a form of cultural expression and defiance. These This period shaped Black identity and connected African Americans to Pan-African ideas and influenced future civil rights activism. The shared struggles. As for racial discrimination, economic oppression, and cultural erasure, when we look at the colonialism in Africa and Jim Crow in the US, both African and African American communities face legal systems that enforce racial hierarchy. For Africa, it was colonial rule. In the US, it was segregation laws or Jim Crow. Economic exploitation in Africa, European colonizers extracted resources, labor, and wealth, leaving many African nations economically dependent after independence. In the US, African Americans were denied economic opportunities through discriminatory policies like sharecropping, redlining, and job segregation. The cultural erasure. African traditions, languages, and religions were suppressed by colonial rule, replaced with European languages, Christianity, and Western education. Enslaved Africans in the Americas were forbidden from practicing their native customs, and African American culture was often dismissed or appropriated. Global solidarity between African and African American activists, Pan Africanism as a movement for unity, like leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and the struggles of African and African Americans as interconnected, advocating for global Black liberation. Du Bois and Nkrumah worked together in Pan-African congresses, pushing for African independence and civil rights in the U.S. Support for African independence and civil rights. When we think about African nations like Ghana's support of the civil rights movement in the U.S., offering asylum and jobs to African Americans escaping racism, we have African American activists like Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture and Angela Davis who spoke out against colonialism and apartheid. We had anti-apartment and black liberation movements on campuses and in cities across the world. African Americans fought against South African apartheid within U.S. civil rights movement and influenced Nelson Mandela and others. The global boycott of South excuse me. The global boycott of South Africa in the 1980s was heavily supported by African American leaders. I was in college, guys, when this was taking place, so I remember this distinctly. Gatherings and meetings talking about products and what we could do to support the boycott. The struggle of African Americans and Africans are deeply connected, with racial oppression, economic exploitation, and cultural erasure shaping their histories. Through global solidarity, activists on both continents have fought for civil rights, independence, and social justice, influencing each other's movement. Wanted to highlight a few of the African independence movements and the people that were involved with that. I don't want to pronounce names because I don't want to butcher them up, so I will pronounce what I can without reading it out. So Kwame led Ghana's independence movement from British rule through the Convention People's Party, CPP. He became prime minister in 1957 when Ghana became the first African nation to gain independence. He promoted Pan-Africanism and helped establish the Organization of African Unity, OIA, in 1963. He was a pioneer of African independence movement and inspired other nations. He advocated for economic self-sufficiency and socialization, focusing on industrialization. He over He was overthrown in a military coup in 1966, partly due to Western backing by the opposition. And that would happen to a lot of leaders back and forth. Jomo Kenyatta, leader of the Kenyan African National Union, KANU, which fought for independence from British rule. Arrested and imprisoned from 1952 to 1961 for alleged involvement in the Mau Mau Rebellion, a violent anti-colonial uprising. He became Kenya's first prime minister in 1963 and later its first president from 1964 to 1978. He led Kenya's transition from British colony to an independent state and promoted the term Harambe, which means pulling together, a call for national unity and economic development. He faced criticism for favoring a capitalist model and authoritarian rule, but remained a symbol of African nationalism. Patrice Lumbanda of the Congo led the movement National Congolese of the MNC, fighting for independence from Belgium, became Congo's first democratically elected prime minister in 1960, opposed Belgian economic control, and sought full sovereignty for the Congo. He was a fierce anti-colonial leader who denounced Belgium's oppression. His radical nationalist stance and ties to the Soviet Union led to Western opposition. Assassinated in 1961 with CIA and Belgium involvement, making him a martyr for African independence. So throughout this lecture, I want to read the quote. I found this wonderful quote by Wangari Mata. I hope I'm saying Kenyan environmentalist activist and first African woman to win a Nobel Peace Prize. We cannot tire or give up. We owe it to the present and future generations of all species to rise up and walk. Throughout this lecture, we have explored the impact of colonialism, the resistance movements in Africa and the African diaspora, and the connections between African and African American struggles. Colonialism reshaped Africa, stripping nations of sovereignty, exploiting resources, and imposing foreign rule. But African leaders like Kwame Ture, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Patrice Lumumba led resistance efforts. African Americans engaged with Pan Africanism, with figures like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey connecting global Black struggles and advocating for self determination. Through shared struggles of racial discrimination, economic oppression, and cultural erasure, highlight the lasting impact of colonial rule and systemic racism. Global solidarity between African and African American activists fueled both the African independence movement and the U.S. civil rights movement. Final thought for you. History is a cycle of oppression and resistance. The fight for justice is ongoing, and the lessons from these movements remain relevant today. I want you to think, how can we continue the legacy of Pan Africanism and resistance in today's world? I ask that you carry forward and recognize the struggles for freedom, justice, and equality, and remain interconnected across the African diaspora. These are references that were used for this presentation. I'll give you time to take a screenshot in case you want to follow up and read and study any of these for yourself. As you see, some of this came from you all's textbook. If you have any questions or comments, shoot me an email at d-wheeler@neiu.edu. I look forward to talking to you, and this is the end of